Good afternoon and welcome to LBMA webinars. Today we have Alan Martin, Head of Responsible Sourcing at LBMA, and Gregory Mthembu-Salter, the Director of Phuzumoya Consulting. I hope I've pronounced that correctly. Here to bring you responsible sourcing and industrial miners in ASM. Before I hand over to the team, I'll just take you through a quick bit of housekeeping. If you do have any questions throughout this webinar, please just drop them into the Q&A panel of your screen. So it should be at the bottom or the top, depending on which version you have. If you can't find this, please do just send an email to ask@lbma.org.uk, and we'll make sure that that question either gets to Greg and Alan during the webinar or after the webinar if you're watching this back recorded. So without further ado, Alan, would you like to take the floor?
Thank you, Taylor. How are you? Thank you, everyone, for joining us. Welcome to the show. And as Taylor said, we're really excited to be joined by Gregory today to talk about responsible sourcing and the potential to improve coexistence between industrial miners and the ASM sector. I've had the pleasure to cross paths with Gregory over the years, and I'm very glad that he's had time to take the time to talk to us today. Briefly, as Taylor mentioned, Greg is the director of Phuzumoya Consulting. It's a South African-based company that specializes in due diligence, political economy, research and analysis. He's also a former member of the UN Group of Experts to the DRC, and he wrote the group's due diligence guidelines for companies sourcing minerals from conflict-affected areas. He's conducted and had published extensive research on supply chains of ASM gold in DRC and Eastern Africa. He's also the author of Wanted Dead and Alive, which was published in 2019. I first thought it was a crime novel until I looked it up and found out it was actually about cattle, specifically South Africans' relationship with our bovine friends and how to balance the environmental aspects of the cattle industry. Welcome, Greg.
Thank you. Good to be here.
Let's maybe start. You were recently on a panel during the LBMA's conference where you made the case that industrial mines could be doing more to capture ASM production and also perhaps play a bigger role in that. And I was wondering maybe if you could maybe set the stage for us because, to my view, too often I think it's a case of two solitudes between the two sectors. And maybe you can start by giving us a sense of how do you describe the current relationship between the two and why is there not more coexistence?
Okay, well, I think that we start off with why we're talking about this, that a lot of the responsible sourcing debate has been about trying to stop bad things happening. It's trying to stop gold that where rents have been collected by armed actors somewhere along the supply chain from getting to market. And different institutions blame each other. LBMA has, delivered a shot across the bows to Dubai Multi-Commodity Center. They've hit back. Anyway, whoever is to blame, and we don't need to get into that now. What I think we can agree on is that all the gold does get to market eventually. So clearly, a strategy that's just based on trying to stop bad things happening is going to have difficulties. So this is really about trying to encourage good things to happen, which is trying to encourage responsibly mined artisanal gold that doesn't finance conflict and to try and get that to market. And that's what everyone says they want. The LBMA's responsible sourcing says it wants it. The World Gold Council says it wants it, but there's hardly any of it. I think only about 24 kilos of this gold has ever come out of Congo. Despite millions being thrown at projects by donors. And I think the real reason this is because the artisanal mines where people have tried to do projects have been small little marginal affairs, or where they've gone to bigger artisanal mines, it's proved impossible to break the stranglehold of the smuggling networks on those mines. There's a German project in Congo where there's 10,000 artisanal miners, but only a small fraction of that gold have they been able to sort of prize away from smuggling networks. So, but what hasn't been explored is the possibility of working on or adjacent to industrial mining permits, where you often find thousands and thousands of diggers who were on those permits and have been kicked off, or were on them and find their way back to them, or have some kind of conflictual relationship. I mean, you ask about the relationship. Well, it's generally pretty terrible. You know, industrial mine permit holders try to enforce their property rights. They bring in the forces of law and order to do so, and that leads to violence and sometimes death. And then on the artisanal side, like in Congo, they will successfully pay off those same forces of law and order to get back into those mine sites. And when we look at the situation in South Africa, I suspect something pretty similar takes place. I don't think these artisanal miners got into underground shafts by accident. So it's a antagonistic, conflictual relationship, and you know, that's, as I say, that's understandable, but room for improvement. With it is possible, if not to cooperate, at least to cohabit in ways that could actually lead to quite substantial volumes of the kind of artisanally mined gold we want to see.
I just wanted to back you up there. I mean, you made the point about how artisanal production is approximately 20% of the global market, and yet, you know, it's only less than 1% of the throughput of GDL refiners. I mean, can you just give us more of a sense of like what are the main obstacles to legally mined ASM gold? You know, what are the obstacles they face getting to market?
Right. Well, starting from the upstream and moving down. But the first problem is for it to be legal, to actually be on a permit that nobody else owns is pretty rare. So there's that sort of straight away, but there might be some tolerance of it at national level. Like in Congo, even though miners are on permits that they're not legally meant to be on, that's sort of permitted. So there's that problem. Then, but the cost of being permitted by the authorities to be in these places is usually very extortionate tax rates, levied by any number of services and or the military. The result that in the Congolese case, the effective tax rate on legal artisanally mined gold is about 12–13%. So when for smuggling, it's not zero, because you have to pay off whoever you have to pay off, but it's nowhere close. So that's a massive obstacle in the upstream. Now, if you look at the downstream, you know, the refiners. So when we did these due diligence guidance, and I worked with the OECD on it, we tried to build in nuance and to say, well, where things aren't perfect, you should work towards it being better. You know, the idea is constructive engagement rather than disengagement. But as this got translated into protocols for auditors, it reverted to being a kind of on-off. And the Dodd-Frank Act in the US was the same. Is it conflict funded or not? And if it is, we can't touch. So the simplest thing for the good delivery list to preserve, to keep their risk profile low, was just to say no. There didn't seem to be any upside to saying yes. You just invited a whole lot of risk. What we've seen in the cobalt space, and cobalt obviously, you know, massively now of interest because of electric vehicles, and with between 60 and 70% of world production in Congo, we had that same initial stance from the end users saying, well, we don't want any artisanal cobalt in our supply chains. But subsequent research has just shown you that what even looks like industrial production in the cobalt supply chain might well have quite a lot of artisanal in it, and there's no real way to avoid it. And now we've started to see the industry, the vehicle industry and the tech industry come in to try to improve, to engage with the artisanal mining sector. So I think you know, that's where we have to go. This stuff is getting to market, and whether it gets to good delivery via Indian jewelry and then back to Dubai into bullion and whatever is the way it goes, it does, because it's certainly not sitting in a warehouse anywhere in East Africa.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, but in this case with the cobalt, was there examples of industrial suppliers or industrial producers, working directly with ASM and integrating it in some kind of systematic fashion, or is it more coming in
And
drips
that
and drabs?
it hasn't got to that point. I mean, you still have the problem that there's still that division at the mines level between the
Yeah.
large scale and the artisanal mining. What we're seeing is the end users recognizing that there is artisanal in their product, and so looking to work with artisanal miners. But no, I mean, cooperation between industrial and artisanal miners. The only place I've really seen it is in the tin production, where we see semi-industrial and industrial tin and tantalum mining in Congo, where those producers are working very closely and have production agreements with cooperatives on their with artisanal mining cooperatives on their permits. I mean, look, it's not an easy thing. In fact, in the Congolese case, the law makes it problematic. They impose this onerous requirement that if you as an industrial permit holder let artisanal cooperatives onto your permit, you then have to legally cede them that bit of your permit, which obviously nobody wants to do. But there are other ways to do it. You can subcontract them as legally constituted companies to provide ore for you, which you could then industrially crush, which I should say is of great interest to the artisanals, because their crushing methods are super inefficient, and they know that they lose a lot of gold that way. So having access to a proper industrial crusher could actually provide the margin to pay that crazy 12-13% I was talking about.
Well, I mean, just to interrupt you there, I mean, I think that kind of leads to the other, one other question I wanted to ask you is, I mean, give us a better sense of like what you're thinking here. I mean, ideally, what do you think would be, one avenue that could be pursued in terms of making greater coexistence between the two sectors?
I think, I mean, there's not one size fits all, and it does depend a bit on national legislation. I think, as you and I were discussing before we came on air now, legislation in Cote d'Ivoire and Ivory Coast is a little bit more lenient and does allow for some measure of cooperation between industrial and artisanal miners, although it's striking that this opportunity has not been taken up. So either there's a problem with the legislation, or mining companies have not yet seen this to be sufficiently imperative. But one way I think that you can do it is that, if you're a mining company, I can imagine a situation where you subcontract to a company that's got a fleet of mechanical diggers to deliver you with a certain amount of ore every month. And I don't see why in principle you can't have a similar contract with a fleet of human diggers who also commit to deliver you a certain volume of ore every month. And then you pay them according to some formula that's based on the volume of ore and an estimate of the gold contained, because giving you bags of sand is not much use to anybody. And you would also require that the artisanal mining operation should be verified by some third party to make sure there's no conflict financing, there's no child labor, and that the pits are constructed according to some sort of health and safety standards. And in fact, could be part of the contract that your health and safety guys work with them on those issues. I think there's formalizing artisanal mining is quite a process, and it does require a commitment. I think that commitment should be coming not just from the mining company, but from the downstream too, that LBMA members, to give substance to the commitments of the responsible sourcing guidance, should be coming together to look for ways that they can help action this, if it's a question of training them in accountancy or whatever is needed. And I think there's also aid programs that are willing to work on this. USAID, the US cooperation, has got a large project trying to develop conflict-free artisanal gold in Congo, and so I think there is the British are looking at things at the moment. So I think there is appetite. So yeah, but what's stopping it, I think, is that mining companies are thinking, well, why should I do this when it's just a lot of headaches? And, you know, what's the upside? And I think my answer to that is that the status quo is terrible. There's these artisanals are still there. They're invading your concession. I mean, I'm very struck by a shift in the type of language, for example, we've been hearing out of Barrick over the last couple of years, where when the mine was getting started, we would hear speeches about how artisanal mining was an archaic industry whose time had come and gone. And it was time to uplift people and get people into proper subcontracting jobs and, you know, serious 21st century jobs. And now just giving a tour to journalists of the Kibali mine just a week or so back, that there's the CEO of Barrick saying, we need to work with the provincial government to find places for artisanal miners to work. We need to look for ways to support it. Now, why that shift? The reason is because those thousands of diggers have not gone anywhere. And that's the point. They don't go anywhere. They're always going to be there. And
the economics of it.
So it's a question of like finally coming to terms with that. Same in South Africa. You can keep trying to police it and treat it as a law and order issue, and the body count is just going to go up and up and up.
I mean, you're given a lot of examples of the status quo can't hold, and the example of crushers getting better yields through industrial processing or relationships with industrial processors. I mean, give us a sense of like some of the other tangible benefits that cooperation for both sides could come out of greater coexistence.
Well, I'll start with the LSM. I'll start with the industry side. I think the benefit is that there is an image problem. The fact that all these efforts are being made on responsible sourcing by your good self and by many others, and yet the situation on the ground remains as it is it engenders a kind of cynicism from the commentariat and consumers that well, why is nothing changing? Or maybe they don't want to, or just people start to suspect bad faith. And I was quite struck in Mark Bristow's presentation to the LBMA conference when people talk about ESG. Everyone's talking about ESG. It's a huge, the way in which the industry manages its relationships with the communities in which it's embedded, and the way in which those relationships are perceived by the international market and consumers is becoming increasingly critical. And this presents the opportunity of a better story to tell. So that's the one. And I think also on local level, it should improve relations with communities. I often, when I go and interview artisanal diggers, the general thing is, why are these guys so greedy? They've got 100 hills. We just want one. And that would help answer that critique. I mean, they can come back and say, look, we built these schools, you've got these wells, you've got the clinics. Yes, but this is what I keep here, this is what one hears. So I do think there's a community, it helps with the social license. Now, on the artisanal side, what they get is a bit of security of tenure, that these industrial mining sites are often relatively hard for predatory state services to access. And that's really huge. You get less ripped off by the army, you get less ripped off by whoever else shouldn't be taxing you. So that's quite good. And you have a guaranteed offtake, and you also enable these artisanals to start escaping from the debt trap in which many of them are in, because all their artisanal gold activity is pre-financed. So they all owe their souls to the company store, to the smuggler's store. And this is a way to begin to get out of that, I think.
But do you envision something where I presume if they're operating on an industrial concession, that in terms of the purchase of that material, the transportation of that material to a GDL refiner, for example, would also be offered as well, right? Would you see that kind of relationship?
I hope so. I hope that it could go all. That's why I say that I'd like the whole stream to be involved, so that one was able to arrange to be sure of offtake. You don't want to go producing gold that gets rejected from good delivery. Relationship is that pricing is really important, because, and we saw this with the tin industry, that if you make your offer too good as the industrial scale miner, you'll have an invasion on your concession, and that will be terrible for everybody. So the price needs to be equal or slightly less than the prevailing price offered by the smuggling networks, so that you don't have a big rush onto your concession.
But if you make it less, what's the incentive then? I mean, if they're getting paid less for the material, why would they
slightly, it's marginally less, but you have the advantage of less harassment,
right.
fewer illegal taxes to pay, and
right.
just a more regular life existence without being moved around and subject to arbitrary, these people's lives are nomadic and difficult, and this would provide a degree of certainty. But I mean, the price issue is tricky. I raised this because the example I cited, which is the closest to this happening, has been difficult. The industrial buyer has set a price that's slightly below the price paid by the itinerant traders, and so the diggers would a lot of them would rather try to sell some of their stuff elsewhere. But they've so that issue, trying to get that to work, has been quite difficult. That's why I talk in terms of cohabitation rather than cooperation. People, the interests are not aligned. They're still buying and selling. There's still a tension in the relationship, but just this is a better way to manage that tension.
Yeah. I mean, we spoke about this before the show started, about how LBMA next year is going to spend a lot of time sort of digging deep into how different models that could be perhaps used to change the status quo, to have direct sourcing increase directly from ASM sources to GDL refiners. I mean, in terms of that, I mean, how is it a question of one size fits all, or what would be your advice about doing that? Is it going to be a multi-pronged approach? What would you recommend?
I think it's such a complex environment that multi-pronged is probably, has to be the way to go. I mean, but getting refiners and their auditors, especially their auditors, on board early on, and I think there has to be a dedicated work stream to I mean, what would be terrible would be to go to all the effort of an industrial miner taking the plunge and saying, okay, we'll do it. Let's work with these cooperatives and finding a way and actually generating some material, and then GDL refiners rejecting the material because their auditors say you can't touch it. So that's whatever it takes to make sure that doesn't happen is I think the key here. And where assurances are needed, I think they can be found. Like I say, I mean, I think when USAID's involved, the British FCDO, the Foreign Office is wanting to, the EU, there's a lot of political goodwill to this. It should be possible to make this happen, providing it's identified as something desirable. And as I say, it has been identified as something desirable at a rhetorical level. It just now have to say, right, well, what that means is we need supply. And if there is that supply, we need to know that there would be demand.
And I think probably another component of that is also the role of banks, because I think there's always this issue of access to financing, which, as you mentioned earlier, a lot of the pre-financing is already done through the black market, and it's a very stable source, and doesn't ask questions the way that formal banks do. So I think there's one, probably another role would be trying to increase the risk level of banks to engage with that.
I mean that is another thing though about working with industrial producers. I mean, I can understand a bank being edgy if the gold has come from some wee little hole in the ground somewhere, some remote part of, we don't even really know where. But if it come from the permit of a permit that they know, that is an established player globally, where there's been due diligence done by reputable third parties, that has been published, then, you know, I think that ought to be acknowledged, and that ought to be acceptable. So that's, I guess, is to establish what would be the level of assurance required. Oh, I see. We're being asked, have we seen the questions? I haven't. But
yes,
here's
so
a question.
There's one question here. It says, in the DRC, industrial miners say they will not want to give up potential income from ASM mining on the concessions, and believe it is the government who should designate zones instead. How do you manage this?
How do you manage it? Yes, it is the government which designates these zones. They're absolutely correct. But what has happened to date is that the zones designated for artisanals have been zones that industrial miners aren't interested in, and have generally quite low amounts of gold in them. So you find that artisanals drift away from them and try and reinvade the industrial permits again. So that hasn't really solved the problem. I mean, fine, let's keep pursuing it. Let's keep trying to set up good ZEAs. That's what they call them, these artisanal zones. But this thing about industrial miners not wanting to give up potential income, yeah, that's true. Obviously, in an ideal world, you'd have the whole permit to yourself. But the whole issue is you don't. There are thousands of diggers there anyway, and it's about how to manage that relationship with them. If it was just like, well, do we want artisanals on our mine or not? Given other things being equal, the answer would be no. But they aren't equal. They are there. So that's what we keep butting our heads up against.
I mean, what you're talking about really I think requires champions. And I think there's a few models. You mentioned the one in Cote d'Ivoire. There's one in DRC, which has obviously policy inconsistencies in it. But from the mining side of things, I mean, what do you think needs to happen to get the ball rolling? And perhaps, are there any kind of templates or models that could act as a template for others?
Yeah, we're a bit short on templates and champions. We're coming into this discussion. Despite the fact that this seems to be going on for ages, it still feels like it's early days of the discussion. It seems like up till now, I think in the tin industry and the tantalum industry, they were the tech end users were really worried about the reputational issues of blood mobile phones and blood laptops, and they responded, and so that the downstream really drove it, and we haven't seen that. Same configuration in the gold industry. So it would take more of a bold step from an industrial miner to take the first step, which is why I think we need to also line up we have previously identified refiners who might be interested, but then their auditors have raised issues. So I think we have to the trick is to line up the bank, the auditor, the refiner, and the miner. And now that may be, that could be that supply chain diplomacy isn't easy. Maybe that's part of the value added of the LBMA or OECD or both to get that conversation going. But I get the sense that everybody's sort of waiting for other people to make the first decisive move. And meanwhile, donors have come in and tried to do projects and thrown millions at things. And as I say, without industrial tenants, as it were, in the program, have only been able to generate really tiny amounts of gold so far. So clearly a donor-led model that doesn't have buy-in from the industrial gold supply chain hasn't demonstrated much so far.
Well, listen, thanks, Greg. I think we're going to leave it there, unless there's anybody with a last-minute question. But I think that I think we're sort of near the end of the show, but I again want to thank you for joining us. I think that was very, very interesting conversation, and I think gives us a lot of food for thought in terms of how LBMA moves ahead on this engagement with ASM and all the actors that are involved in that, whether it's the auditors, the miners, the banks. And with that, I'll hand it over back to Taylor, and thanks again, Greg.
Thank you.
Thank you very much, both of you, for joining us. As Alan and Gregory have dealt with all of the questions that have come in today, if you do have any questions following this webinar, or if you are watching it back pre-recorded, please do email us at ask@lbma.org.uk. We'll make sure to send those across to Alan and Greg. That's it for this webinar, but I'm going to move on very quickly to what we have upcoming. We do have on the 4th of November the Global Macroeconomic Outlook. So for those of you who did not get the chance to attend the session at the conference we just had recently, this is we are releasing the session, so you can come along and watch everything that happened if you did miss it, or if you were in the wrong time zone or you didn't catch it on the platform. So that will be on the 4th of November, and that will be sent out as a recording. Following that, we do have our events coming in December. So we have our annual dinner for members and pre-dinner seminar, as well as our 2 training days for Loco London. So that's an introduction to Loco London and how to use Loco London. So if you have any questions about that, again, email ask@lbma.org.uk. And finally, for the events, we do have our Precious Metals Conference next year. So that is running from the 16th to the 18th of October. And our launch sale rate is still applicable until the end of December. And if you have any questions for that one, it's a different email address, conference@lbma.org.uk. So that's it for events, but I do have a few things I just want to shout out for the Marcoms team. We have distributed a survey for the conference, so if you were there, please do answer that. There will be a prize draw for a £100 Amazon gift voucher, which I don't know about you, but I can think of many things that I could buy for that on Amazon. Unfortunately, yeah, Greg's book. Yeah, exactly.
You get a few copies.
Yeah, a few copies. We'll get them signed. We'll make it work. So that's the first thing. The second thing is we do have our members survey. So we're calling for all members to participate. And in completing, we have another prize. It's a 1 ounce gold bar as a thank you for your contribution. So this survey is designed to kind of better understand your needs and your expectations as a member, as a subscriber, or as a relevant stakeholder in LBMA, and how we're doing in terms of meeting them. So you have until Friday the 29th to participate in that one. And for the conference, it's next Wednesday. So I realise I should have done those in reverse, but just aim to get everything done for next Wednesday and you should be fine. The early bird gets the worm. And then finally, following the regulatory briefing that went out last week, we will be emailing all members this afternoon to let them know that the documentations to assist with the UK REACH compliance is now available in the My LBMA portal. If you don't have one, you can easily set one up. Again, just give us a shout if you don't know how to do that, and we'd love to help. So at the end of that, again, I'm going to thank the host and our panelists once more, and thank you for joining us, attendees. We'll see you very soon at the next webinar. So without further ado, have a lovely afternoon.
Take care.
Thanks, then. Bye-bye.